Welcome, everyone. My name is Esther Lee, President of Chinese American Heritage Foundation. Today is the last day of the AAPI month. Let's not forget our extraordinaire American hero, Norman Y. Mineta. He co-founded the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus and served its first chair in 1994. Chinese American Heritage Foundation is honored to host and pay tribute to the Honorable Norman Mineta with a few other organizations: Chinese American Citizens Alliance, the Committee of 100, Council of Korean American, Japanese American Citizen League, National Federation of Filipinos American Association, and OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates. We will have 10 video tributes and fireside chats with 6 distinguished guests this evening. One of our guests is our moderator, Chen, former Vice Mayor of Fremont, California. Sue is an immigrant daughter of parents from China who was born and raised in Peoria, in Illinois, at the time when there was no diversity. Growing up, she was often teased and bullied as there were very few Asian at that time. Growing up in a Chinese laundry and restaurant, she learned the lesson and value of hard work. Her dream to move to California came true when she attended graduate school in Los Angeles. Always community involved, she was elected to the 4th largest city, the San Francisco Bay Area, Fremont, California City Council, as the first Chinese American female to serve as the vice mayor and council member. During her service, she was very active in AAPI leadership roles locally, statewide, and federally. She continued to advocate for our AAPI community in her current capacity as an elected community college board trustee and chair of the AAPI trustees and administrators caucus of the C.A.C.A community colleges. Let us welcome Chen, and she will introduce the rest of the 5 guests.
Good evening, everyone. We're so pleased to have you join us tonight. First, I want to give a special shout out to our ever amazing Esther and Wilson Lee. It was their idea that this would be a perfect way to mark the last day of AAPI Heritage Month by honoring and celebrating a true American hero, the Honorable Norman Mineta. Secondly, I would like to express our deep appreciation to all of our co-sponsors who made this event possible. As you can see, we have a cross-section of Asian American groups who, when invited, were quick to join because we all know Norman Mineta was our iconic AAPI leader who fought for equity and justice for all. As an overview of tonight's program, we'll begin by showing a number of tribute videos by some very distinguished guests. The videos will be followed by a fireside chat with our amazing panelists, many whose friendships with Norm span decades. They will share with us their unique relationship with Norm that will give us a personal insight on how he impacted them. After the fireside chat, we will be viewing more moving tributes, video tributes as we close out the program. So with that, let's begin. Esther, as they say, lights, camera, action.
Norman Mineta is a patriot and a public servant who history will remember for his moving life story and many accomplishments. Mayor of San Jose, Congressman, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Transportation, and business and nonprofit sector leader. During World War II, the Mineta family was interned for several years at Hart Mountain, and yet Norm was never bitter, never broken by this horrendous act by his own government. Instead, he remained positive, optimistic, and went on to a life of public service to help others. I got to know Norman Mineta when I became the first Asian Pacific American Deputy Secretary in the federal government, the highest level for an Asian Pacific American to attain in the executive branch at that time. Norm was then chairman of the House Surface Transportation Subcommittee. He and I worked together on transportation issues, and I remember how nice he always was. His kindness was so appreciated. We became cabinet colleagues in the President George W. Bush administration. His role as Secretary of Transportation on September 11th, 2001 will always be remembered. Norm was well-liked, always congenial, and laid back. He and his beloved wife, Denny, were always a constant presence on the A-list social scene. They were very active in the Washington community, and they participated as part of this community. Norm was also a very active supporter of the Asian American community. He and Denny always showed up for events in support of the Asian Pacific American community. Our hearts are with Denny and Norm's family at this time. America has lost a patriot and a great public servant. We will always remember Norm's many contributions to our country and in particular, our Asian Pacific American community.
Hi, I'm Senator Tammy Duckworth. Thank you to the Chinese American Heritage Foundation and the Chinese American Citizens Alliance Boston for hosting this memorial in honor of Secretary Mineta and for inviting me to participate today. Norm Mineta was not only a leader in the Asian American community and a mentor to so many, myself included, over the last 5 decades, he was a giant of American history as well. As a first-generation Japanese American who was forced from his home and held in an internment camp as a boy during World War II, Norm chose to dedicate his life's work to his country by striving to change our nation for the better. He served under Republicans and Democrats while making such a big difference in our nation because that's what he cared about first and foremost. Whether in the dark days after 9/11 or the decades America reckoned with a legacy of internment, Norm Mineta's leadership and persistence helped our nation emerge from many of our worst moments stronger and more united. His name is synonymous with transportation, so much so that the Department of Transportation headquarters is literally named after him. As an influential House Committee chair and later as the longest-serving Secretary of Transportation, he knew how to bring people together to solve problems and get things done. He would say, "There's no such thing as a Democratic highway or a Republican bridge." We live in a better nation thanks to Norm's legacy, and we've lost someone really important who will be dearly missed.
The world will miss Norman Mineta, not only for all the great accomplishments, but for all the lives he's touched along the way. He genuinely cared about people. He's the person that, you want to say hi to. He's the person that, you want to be around because he makes you better. He makes you a better person. I know Secretary Norman Mineta through my mother, Michiko Yi. A long time ago, he was my mom's insurance agent. My service in the military was an additional connection with him. He was a very proud member of the Japanese American Veterans Association, a great organization. What I appreciate most about him, in addition to the great leadership that he provided to our country in all the roles that he had, he was a good person.
Being a first-time car owner, I was about 24. Someone said to me, "You need to get an insurance agent." Norman was in business with his father at the time, and they lived right across Wesley Methodist Church off 5th Street in San Jose. Well, he was always very friendly, very open, and very entertaining. I think he was very gregarious. He enjoyed visiting with people and talking to people. He was always very warm and very friendly. I followed his career. I would hear things about him in San Jose. He became a mayor, and then later on, I understood he ran for the House of Representatives. So in 1976, I was married by that time and had 3 children. I thought it might be a great idea to take a bicentennial trip with our 3 children. So we made a trip across the United States. We visited Norman in the House of Representatives, so I made contact with him then and asked to see the house, and he was gracious enough to take us through there and into the underground subway that connected us to Congress, and that was a thrilling experience to be able to do that. In the past several years, I made trips to Washington, D.C. to see the cherry blossoms, and my son, who was involved in the military, was acquainted with Norman and arranged for us to meet on different occasions. They named the San Jose airport after him, which I thought was really quite an accomplishment. And then later on, I found out they even named a highway after him, which surprised me. I thought, my goodness, I didn't realize the importance of all the things that he'd done. He never lost touch with his humanity. He was always a wonderful person, caring, interested in you as a person. He never forgot who you were. I'm so proud of him.
Greetings. There is so much to say about what Norm Mineta meant to us that it's difficult to know where to start. I'll begin by sharing that while I've been on the board of the Committee 100, Norm's service on our advisory council provided us with indispensable advice on how to navigate the pathways of Washington and the halls of Congress. For me and many in my generation, Norm has been a role model, but personally, he's been so much more, becoming my friend, colleague, mentor, and confidant. I first met Norm 30 years ago following Bill Clinton's election as president, when as an Asian American state officeholder from Texas, I met with the Clinton transition team in Washington and also visited with Norm, who was the chair of the Powerful House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. I found Norm to be unpretentious, self-deprecating, and of course, eager to listen. Ultimately, in late 1990, our paths crossed in a dramatic fashion when I was serving in the Clinton administration as an Assistant Secretary of Energy. The U.S. Department of Energy was embroiled in controversy over claims of espionage allegedly committed by Chinese American scientist Wen-Ho Lee at Los Alamos National Laboratory. The AAPI community was outraged over perceptions of lack of due process and claims by other AAPI scientists that they had been racially profiled. As I was the highest ranking AAPI political appointee at Energy, the Secretary of Energy tasked me to meet with an AAPI delegation led by Norm. After the group meeting, Norm chatted with me privately. I told him that I was in a difficult position, given my obligations at the department, which were at odds with the AAPI community with whom I closely identified. Norm was non-judgmental and sympathetic. He understood my unusual task and asked if he could serve as a resource to me, an offer I gladly accepted. In the weeks and months that followed, Norm called me often to ask how I was doing. His calm demeanor and voice during this period became a source of comfort. Despite my personal doubts and flagging morale, Norm encouraged me to stay at the department and to find ways to continue serving the AAPI community. I am certain that the spirit of selflessness led Norm to serve not only as our Commerce Secretary in the Clinton administration, but also as our Transportation Secretary in the Bush administration. The latter appointment he chose to accept, notwithstanding objections from many close friends and allies following the controversy over the election outcome in the year 2000. Above all else, Norm served the country when asked by the president, even under one for whom he did not vote. His sense of duty to country endured, despite his being forced into an internment camp with his Japanese American family decades earlier at the outbreak of World War II. Now and for the remainder of our lives, I and others will continue to aspire to the ideals espoused and examples set by Norm Mineta.
Those videos were amazing. They really convey how respected Norm was. And to hear those words of praise, while not surprising, are truly remarkable. This is a perfect segue to our fireside chat, and I'd like to begin by introducing our very distinguished panelists. Maeley Tom is recognized as one of the most powerful and influential non-elected political figures in the AAPI community because of her accomplishments and contributions to the empowerment of the API Islander voice in politics at the state and national level. Maeley holds the unique distinction of being the only ethnic minority and woman to break the glass ceiling by serving both as the Chief Administrative Officer of the California State Assembly and Chiefs of Staff to the President of the California State Senate. Maeley's public service is extensive. Most notably, she is the founding president of the API Legislative Caucus Institute and the Capitol Academy. She is well recognized for her mentorship of generations of APIs who now serve in local, state, and federal elected offices. She certainly was my mentor. Her recently published memoir, I Am Not Who You Think I Am, recounts her extraordinary personal story of public service as she rose through the ranks to become one of the most influential AAPI female trailblazers in California politics. Maeley is also a member of the Committee 100, and I'm going to be posting a link to her book, and I would encourage everyone to read it. It's an amazing story. The Honorable Floyd Mori, as his Facebook page states, this farm boy loves sports, music, and family, who became a dad, professor, politician, and activist. Like Norm, he served as a city council member and the mayor of the city of Pleasanton, California, and as a California Assembly member. Floyd has been a member, president, and the executive director of the Japanese American Citizen League, and he spoke out against the then President Trump's Muslim ban. He also served as the president CEO of the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies in Washington, D.C. And I believe, Floyd, that's where we first met. In 2012, Mori received the Order of the Rising Sun, the Gold Rays with Rosette, in recognition of his contributions to the improvement of the status of Japanese Americans, strengthening economic relations between Japan and the United States, and the promotion of Japanese culture in the United States. While retired, he continues to be active in politics and public service, or as to use the vernacular of today, Floyd is a highly regarded influencer. Carolyn Hong Chan, a native of Greenville, Mississippi, currently calls Albuquerque, New Mexico home. A former teacher, Carolyn's extensive involvement as a community and national organizer of projects focused on literacy, youth education, civil and human rights, political activism, preservation, and sharing of Chinese American history. Carolyn spearheaded the Chinese American Citizens Alliance annual congressional education trips and its collection of stories of Chinese American veterans for the Veteran History Project and the Congressional Recognition of Asian Civil War Veterans. From 2009 to 2013, Carolyn was the national president of the C.A.C.A., where she served on the steering committee of the 1882 project, which, with many collaborative partners, accomplished the congressional expressions of regret for the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. The C.A.C.A. awarded its highest honor, the Spirit of America Award, to Carolyn in 2015. She currently serves as a board member of the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum and on the national board of C.A.C.A. The Honorable Mike Honda, looks like he's driving. Mike is a third generation Sansei who was born in Walnut Grove, California. An educator, politician, community leader, and Peace Corps volunteer who, by the way, speaks perfect Spanish. Mike began his political career when then Mayor of San Jose, Norman Mineta, appointed him to the Planning Commission. And that's where he got the political bite and has never looked back. Later, Mike served on the Santa Clara Board of Supervisors in 2001. He followed Norm's footsteps and was elected to Congress, where he served for 16 years. Mike has championed legislation regarding women's rights, living wages, the environment, healthcare, and human rights. His Washington, D.C. office always had an open door policy for his constituents to come and visit. I visited there many times while he was in office. He continues to mentor and to provide sage advice to the next generation of AAPI public servants. And oh, by the way, did you know Mike is an awesome karaoke singer? He does a one mean rendition of My Way. Dianne Fukami. Dianne has produced, directed, and written more than a half dozen documentaries of the Asian American experience, which have broadcasted on PBS stations throughout the United States. Separate Lives, Broken Dreams, about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and was nominated for a National Emmy Award. Starting Over, Japanese Americans After the War, has received scholarly citations for its first-person anecdotes. Her most recent documentary, Stories from Tokoku, was showcased at the CamFest in 2014 and screened at film festivals in New York and Los Angeles. She is one of the executive producers of the Mineta Legacy Project, which captures the life, career, and contributions of Secretary Norman Y. Mineta in an hour-long nationally televised documentary and an online educational curriculum for high school and college students. Norman Mineta, His Legacy, An American Story, a film about injustice, redemption, and a burning desire for all to be treated equally. As you can see, we have gathered before you a truly remarkable panel of superstars who will be sharing some reflections and memories of Secretary Mineta. So let's start off by asking each of you to share a personal recollection or moment that you had with Norm that perhaps the public did not know about him. All funny stories are welcome. So let's start with Maeley, followed by Floyd, then Carolyn, Mike, and Dianne. So Maeley, please.
I have so many, so I'm going to try to be as quick as possible because I have a 50-year relationship with Norman Mineta because he was a rising star in Congress, and we in the legislature, the late Georgette and I, were starting the Asian Pacific movement in the Capitol. And I have to tell you that I am on this panel with two other icons who are instrumental in awakening the voice of Asians in state government. One is Floyd Mori, who is our first legislator who helped us start this movement. And the second is, of course, Mike Honda, who made sure that the Asian Pacific voice was relevant and powerful. So I thank you for allowing me to share this panel with two of my own icons here. Norm was our go-to guy in national politics when we were just starting. And he was because he was so accessible. And he helped us with issues like redress and immigration reform, helping the Vietnamese fishermen own their own fishing boats. So we formed a relationship with him then. But when I got involved in presidential politics, he became my cheerleader. And he gave my role a lot of credibility because he was so popular and so respected in Congress. And as he clearly understand that Asian women had a tougher time and a tougher hill to climb in national politics. So he kept on telling me, you have to not be afraid to be that nail that sticks out in the wood. I mean, that was his favorite saying. But I have to say that we became more personal friends during the time he was out of office. He was out of office for 5 years. And that's the time where we went to socialize together just as friends. And he enjoyed that because I connected with him and made sure that he was always, honored and recognized at events, and what a role model he was. So our friendship grew beyond professional friendship. And we all know when he became first cabinet member, everything changed, but he didn't change. He was just simply himself. The last time I heard from Norm, which I want to share with everyone, was when they sent me a video singing happy birthday to me. And then a couple of months ago, Norm just called to talk about my book. That's how he is. And he joked and said, Maeley, he says, I keep your book on my coffee table. So when I'm in Zoom, people can see your book on my coffee table. That's simply how Norm is about friends and how loving he is. He was in such great spirits. And he felt that being the first Asian cabinet member, he was so humble about it that he said, Maeley, I just was lucky. That was exactly how Norm was. He just said, I was just lucky, but I'm going to be able to open doors so other Asian role models can follow. So I want to end by just saying he made such an impact in my life. He was my mentor, my role model, and most of all, he was there for me through thick and thin. All of us go through bad points in politics. And when I was caught up with the Asian finance scandal, it was Norm's shoulders I stood on. He would not allow it to get me down. He simply would not. So I have to say, when Norm passed, many of us simply could not believe that we lost him because we just felt he could live forever. And he was such a giant. And I think he's the closest political figure that we have that's comparable to Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez to our community. And, I want to conclude by saying, as Tom Brokaw said, he was simply a part of the greatest generation. And I was so lucky to have called him my mentor and friend.
Wonderful. And Floyd?
Anyway, great to follow Maeley because when I entered the legislature way back, about 45, more than that, years ago, Maeley was one of the very few Asian American staff members there in the state legislature. A lot different than today. If you look today, you have many key staff members as well as a much larger Asian American caucus there in Sacramento. Of course, Mike is another gentleman that I've had to put up with for a lot of years, but it's been enjoyable put up. Now, Norm, when I was elected as a city councilman way back in 1972, that's 50 years ago, he was one of the very first to call and congratulate me. And from that moment on, Norm knew what to do. He engaged me. He involved me. He'd call me and say, how about Floyd, call this guy or talk to this person about this, to get me engaged in the issues and the matters of the day. Please help this organization. So he helped us younger people get engaged and involved. Then on a personal basis, Norm had his sort of Mineta mafia down there in San Jose. And a lot of leaders, one of them was included Mike, and often invited me down on a personal basis to get acquainted with good people in the Japanese American community down there, judges, other civil servants in the San Jose area and in the Bay Area. And it helped me to develop a more personal kind of a relationship, not just a distant political relationship with people. During my career, I've had a lot to do with young people. And I happened to go to the White House a couple of weeks ago and spent a week in Washington, D.C. During Asian American Pacific Islander Week. And I look around and these young people that I knew like 10, 15 years ago now staff the White House. They now are main staffers on the Hill. They're in agencies as assistant secretaries. These young people are the people that Norm touched. Whether it was the President of the United States or this young high school intern kind of puttering around the halls of the Capitol, Norm treated them the same and help these young people feel like they were important and they could be something and do something. And because of Norm, these young people of yesterday are now a very important decision-making people of today. Norm has influenced people from Boston to San Diego, from Seattle to Miami, from Houston to Chicago, you name any part of the United States. It's not just San Jose, California. Norm has had an impact throughout the country, and not just with Japanese Americans, with all the Asian Americans throughout the country. It's been such an honor for me to be associated with him and call him a friend for the past 50 years.
Thank you, Floyd. And so let's see, Carolyn.
Thank you very much. In 1999, the Albuquerque chapter of the C.A.C.A. was hosting the national convention in Albuquerque. We needed a charismatic keynote speaker who could inspire, motivate, and challenge our delegates, as well as the students who were attending our Asian Students in Action, our concurrent student leadership training conference. I was serving as chair of the Natural History Museum of New Mexico, their capital campaign at the time. And one of our lead sponsors at the museum was Lockheed Martin, for which Norm was serving as a vice president at the time. And we thought that Norm was the best fit for being the spokesperson at the convention. But how were we going to get him to Albuquerque? Well, it just turned out that Jerry, a fellow committee member, was a manager at Sandia National Lab, which was managed nationally by Lockheed Martin. So I approached Jerry and asked him, would you try to get Norm sent to us pro bono by Lockheed Martin as our keynote speaker for this banquet, because he would be such an inspirational role model for not only our members, but these young people that we would like to become our leaders in the upcoming and succeeding generations. 2 weeks before the convention, I contacted Norm's office to confirm the arrangements. I was totally shocked when they told me that they knew nothing about our trip, about his trip. Our event had fallen through the cracks because of a staff change. Frantically, I asked Jerry to contact Lockheed's national headquarters to come through as promised. Early in the week of the convention, Norm's new assistant called to confirm his travel arrangements. She added, Mr. Mineta would like you and your husband to join him for sushi lunch arranged by an old friend, Ruth. I completed the sentence with Hashimoto, 6 degrees of separation. Everyone in Albuquerque knew Ruth Hashimoto, a New Mexico treasure and activist who had been Norm's babysitter or caretaker at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. At lunch, we learned so much about our common struggles for our rights and acceptance as Americans. He and Ruth empathized with my growing up in Mississippi under segregation and Jim Crow laws. Norm's speech motivated our members and the student delegates to become even more active in civic affairs locally and nationally. His impact as a role model for youth became evident even a generation later. For example, a leading female physician in California acknowledged the benefit that she had gained from her attendance at the Asia conference in Albuquerque. Our Albuquerque team coordinator of Asia is now an attorney with the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. My son, Rusty, who's online today, is the National Secretary for C.A.C.A. He performs in a readers Theater for New Mexico JACL to tell the story of Japanese American internment camps in New Mexico. C.A.C.A.'s legislative education team members attending the Apex Gala always made it a point to greet Norm and thank him for his visit to Albuquerque. He encouraged us and directed us to the proper channels to discuss our priorities, especially the expressions of regret for the Chinese Exclusion Acts and the Congressional Gold Medal for Chinese American veterans of World War II. Norm's extraordinary contributions as an elected official, a dedicated public servant, an American patriot, changed our national political and social landscape. We extend our heartfelt condolences to the Mineta family. We offer our deepest gratitude for the Honorable Norman Y. Mineta's legacy, which will live on in the service of those, by those whose lives he's touched. We will continue to show up, speak up, and take action. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. And Dianne?
You know, back in 2012, we had the idea. Well, we didn't have the idea in 2012. We approached Norm about wanting to do a documentary about his life. Many people had been approaching him over the years, and this had become a running joke between Norm and me. I would see him at social functions and political occasions, and he would always remember everybody's name, and he would greet me warmly, and I would say to him, "So Norm, what about that documentary?" And he would laugh and he would say, "Oh no, nobody wants to hear about me. I'm just an average Joe." And so that almost became a running joke between us. Every time I would see him, I'd say, "So how about that documentary?" And in 2012, he said yes. So my co-producer, Deborah Nakatomi, and I were floored, to put it mildly. After 7 years of asking him, he finally said yes. And when we began production on it, it was such a wonderful experience. I didn't have the close long-time relationship that many of you have had with him. But in the 7 years, and yes, it took 7 years to produce this thing, in the 7 years that I worked with him on it, I was privileged to get to know Norm really well, his family, his close associates, and it was really an honor to do that. Norm and I had maybe about five different meetings where I sat down for 2 hours at a time to talk to him, in addition to some of the interviews that we had done. And the thing that touched me the most is I could tell how much he loved his family, first of all, more than anything, his sons, Denny, the grandchildren, but also how much he loved his country, the United States of America. And, near the end of our interview time, I gave him what I thought was sort of a kiss-off question, which was, "Norm, why do you always wear that American flag pin?" And for those of you who've seen him at official functions, you know that he always had that on his lapel. And I thought I was going to get some soundbite about being an uber patriot or about how much you love the country. And he casually looked at that pin and he said, "Oh, this was given to me after 9/11. I wear this pin so that, people look at you and they don't know you, and I could tell they're sizing me up and looking at me up and down and just wondering. And then they see the pin and they know I'm an American." And, when you're behind the camera, you aren't supposed to make any noise or anything because you don't want to interrupt the flow of conversation, nor do you want your voice to be part of the recording. And I had these silent tears streaming down my face because here was a man who was in his 80s at the time, who had years of public service, and he still felt that he had to wear this American flag pin to prove to the rest of the country that he was an American. And that will always stay with me. In many ways, Norm had never admitted to himself and to other people about how scarred he was by the incarceration experience. But in every move that he made, in every attempt that he did to lift up other people, whether it be people of color, BIPOC people, or just people who were in underrepresented and underserved areas, Norm never forgot where his roots were and what he had to endure to get to be to who he was. And I really appreciate that about him.
Thank you so much, Dianne. I think your words really touched all of us. And so next, we're going to have the incomparable, Honorable Mike Honda.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you texted me, because I was just coming out of a doctor's office. And when I saw that, I just didn't want to miss it. And thank you very much for putting this together for Norm. Much been said about Norm, and a lot of it is a very common experience among all of us. You know, him making us feel comfortable in spite of the fact that his level of attainment and his office has been very high in this country, and yet we felt like we just can call him Norm rather than saying Congressman or Mr. Secretary. But I guess one other term he did like is mayor. And I think that that's where he really began to cut his teeth on a lot of these social changes that started occurring across this country. Norm was the kind of guy that never did forget his experiences, but he also looked around to see what is it that I can do to improve other people's lives or to be a voice for them. And as mayor, he used to sit in a wheelchair for about a week to get around the city. And people asked him, why are you doing this? He says, just to understand what it's like to be in a wheelchair or be physically disabled and get around the city. And after a week of that, he really started to look at doing curb cuts in the city of San Jose. And when he authored the iced tea legislation for the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, where he was chair, he spent almost an entire year going around the country, gathering information, listening to people, as he usually does with us, and put together this legislation, which included curb cuts all across the country, all because he remembered from his mayor's experience that this is important for those that we don't even think about. And that's the kind of person he is. And so this legislation, although it'd be a landmark legislation for the country, it reflects that his ability to pull together not only transportation, but environmental issues, folks who have different modes of transportation and different needs. And that's the kind of person he was. It was mentioned earlier that he sort of spoke up and defended the Vietnamese shrimpers. And I think that when he became congressperson here in San Jose, A.A.P.I. had a meeting with them, and we said, you're a congressman, you're Asian American, and it's going to be great that you're going to represent all the Asian American diaspora across this country. And he said, wait a minute, let me think about that. And when he thought about it, he realized that he needed to be, and he's probably the very few individuals in Congress, on the Hill, Senate, and in the House that really took on the responsibility to be the voice of all the API, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander voice for all of us in Congress, because no one else really thought about it. Everybody thought that they're going to be a congressperson for their own constituents. But Norm understood that he had a larger constituency across this country that has had a similar experience that he had in some way or another, that this country had not fulfilled its great promise of equal protection. And he continues to do that. And he was a great influence on President Bush when 9/11 occurred, where the policy of no racial profiling became an institution throughout this country. So Norm, never forgetting who he is, where he came from, or the experiences he had, that even though he loved this country, that he knew this country was not perfect and had let us down. And he made it his job also to make sure that those things will never happen again. The HR 442 indicated why we went to camp. And it said in summation that it was because of racial prejudice or racial bigotry, war hysteria and the failure of political leadership, not the absence of it, but the failure of it. And he was damned that he's going to never fail in political leadership on behalf of those who needed a voice, or behalf of those people who are newcomers to this country. So I think that's a legacy and a responsibility, a torch that she's passing on to all of us to continue that work and to not allow the failure of political leadership occur again, where it will put people who deserve the protection of our Constitution in danger. And so if we remember that, then the legacy of Norm will continue. And I think that he's got a great memory. He's got a ironclad memory for names. But if we just remember one thing, that we continue this political leadership in the format that he saw and we share, then I think that he will say to us, "You are truly a friend, and thank you for remembering me and working in this manner, because you do this country a great favor, but you also do me a favor by remembering the kind of work that I thought was important and pass that on to all of us." So we just have to do what he's done, stand up to be seen, speak up to be heard, and to lead in order for us to form this thing called a more perfect union. And thank you very much for this opportunity, in spite of the fact that I was wearing a t-shirt and no tie.
No worries, Mike. I wanted to share a very quick story about Norm. I think my husband put, he had
Can you hear me?
invited. Oh, yeah, I can.
Okay.
So I had invited Norm to speak at a very large event of over 1,000 people. And so the arrangements were that we were going to be sending a limousine to the airport to pick him up. Well, the limousine got to the airport and there was Norm Mineta. And at that time, we were thinking, my goodness, where is he? Did he miss his flight? We hadn't heard from him. And we were kind of frantic. And we were outside of the hotel when all of a sudden, a taxi drives up and out steps Norman Mineta. And we said, oh my goodness, you're okay. I mean, we were so worried that we had sent out a limousine for you. And he goes, oh, I don't need a limousine. I just took a taxi. Because he was humble, because he didn't want to be fussed about. That's the Norman Mineta that just shows who he was. He came from a very humble background. He always remembered his roots. He always remembered that he wasn't above anyone. And as we said, you know, equality and justice, he certainly epitomized that. So, yes? Okay. So next, I think we're going to have some individual questions to our panelists. And I'm going to start with Maeley. Maeley, you know, we all affectionately refer to you as the female trailblazer of AAPI politics in California. Can you please tell us what impact Norm had on you as you were facing the challenges of breaking barriers in politics as an Asian woman?
Norm always had a very calm demeanor about him. And he was always very soothing. He would raise questions to me about how I feel would be the best choices facing me, either fighting to climbing the ladder in the Capitol, fighting people who wanted to see Asians fail, quite frankly, because they felt, you know, jealousy and being the first ethnic minority. But whenever I talked to Norm, he never played into my feelings of inadequacies or about my questioning myself. You know, he would always say, you are where you are, and you have a responsibility on your shoulders to represent the best of our community. He said, Maeley, that's your responsibility. You have the opportunity, so don't blow it. Don't blow it by questioning your own self, because you are carrying the image of Asians climbing the ladder to demonstrate excellent, to demonstrate capabilities, but more important, to have the courage to confront your challenges. So he always spoke to me in a very wise, sympathetic, and yet tough way in terms of how I needed to handle a lot of these challenges. But the most important thing about Norm Mineta, he was always accessible. You pick up the phone, he's there. If he can't be there, he'll call you back. No problem was too small for Norm Mineta. Nothing was beyond his capabilities to help you, no matter what important task he was handling in Congress. If you called, he was there. That's the amazing, wonderful part of this human being.
Thank you, Maeley. That was great. Okay, well, this next question is for Mike and Floyd. Both of your political careers were closely aligned with Norm. What was it like to be the holy trinity of the California AAPI legislators? And how did Norm guide and influence you?
Go ahead, Floyd.
Well, Holy Trinity, I think, is a little much there, but it was really.
We're the Holy Trinity, the Maeley's, the Mother Mary.
Norm was by himself, really. He understood this whole issue of relationships and how relationships are so important for people in elected positions to be able to accomplish. It's something you don't do all by yourself. You've got to have relationships, whether it be across the aisle or whether it be with this group of people. He always guided me in a way that said, Floyd, you need to talk to this person about running for office. I talked to him last week, and let's see if we get him to run for office. Or on the other hand, somebody that's challenging somebody that should not be challenged at this time. Let's talk to him about not running rather than running, and getting engaged in other organizations. Floyd, you need to go talk to this organization and help them do this and that. So my mindset from the relationship I had with Norm and the guidance and that he gave to me was that relationships are key. And everything he did with me, he helped me to develop a relationship further with somebody or with some group or with some section of our society. He was just good at that, to get you engaged and involved, not in it all for yourself, not what you did, but what you can do for others. And look what he did. He got Mike in public office, and have we ever benefited from that, Mike?
Is that a question or a statement?
A statement, of course. A statement. A very loud statement.
Well, you talk about Norm sharing and giving us advice, and sometimes he may be alone, but if we really think about it, all of us here on the screen, without exception, have been a recipient of his advice and his thoughts. But also, I'll bet you that he also called us too. For instance, when he was being nominated by Bush, it concerned him that as a Democrat serving in a Republican cabinet and Republican administration, concerned him in terms of his liability and his ability to be able to influence a policy in this country. And I think when he helped and supported Maeley during that Democratic fiasco, that gives us a lot of firm stability. When he talks to you, Floyd, or to myself, it made us feel validated. Well, when he called us and we said to him, and I'm sure all of us did the same thing. You know, if any Democrat criticizes you for serving in a Republican administration, they forget that we'll have you inside the administration as our eyes and ears and our voice if something goes amiss or awry in the cabinet. And because he thought about it and he said, yeah, I need to be there. And he made a big impact, not only in transportation infrastructure, but also in the thinking of the administration leadership when he was president, especially after 9/11. And so, you know, if we ever think that we don't have a role to play in a mixed administration, then we don't give ourselves enough credit to be able to be the voice and be the presence of the values that we believe in. And I think that that was the advice that a lot of us had shared with him. And said, of course, you know, you have the strength, the value to be able to serve in that administration and serve us well. And he did. And so I think, you know, not to only talk about Norm and you, Maeley, with your book, you not only were the female leader, you were the leader, you know, gender aside, because there was nobody else there doing the kind of work you were doing. It was because I think the mentorship of Norm and Floyd, you know, all the stuff that's going on in our country in terms of camps being designated as national parks and national designation was because you sharing your history with the guy named Bill Thomas, you know, a right-wing guy that teared when we heard about our experiences in camps. So I think he helped us be able to share the kinds of things that happen to us in a way that it has positive outcomes. And I think that that's a great legacy to have. And in terms of the troika, the females, you know, top of the peak is folks like Maeley and Georgette that really paved the way for a lot of us to have the courage to speak up. So out there on
Sue, Sue, if I can follow up on Mike, and Mike, thank you, but it took a village. It took a village with you and Floyd, who was there at the beginning. But I would also like to add to Mike's comment, the sensitivity that Norm had when he was offered this position by calling some of us for our feedback shows the love, the affection, and the responsibility he felt representing Asian Americans. He wanted to make sure that he was going to do right by Asian Americans by calling a number of us. That's the kind of soul he was. That's the kind of love and passion he had for our community. I just want to add that, Mike. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'd like to ask Carolyn the next question. You know, Norm worked very closely with the C.A.C.A, Chinese American Citizens Alliance, and how did that cross-pollination of both Chinese American and Japanese American communities strengthen our united efforts under the label of Asian Pacific Islanders to really promote and advocate for each other as well as other Asian groups?
I think because we had this common experience of not being accepted and recognized as Americans, all of us who had America in our hearts, loved our country, and wanted to become full citizens, being able to contribute to it. So we found that as a common goal. And as I learned about the Japanese, I mean, when I was just a little kid, it was during wartime. And I actually had to attend a segregated school in Mississippi of just Chinese American kids, and until after World War II. But I think we were able to come together and recognize that we are all of humankind. We're human beings that experience the same aspirations. We want to be contributors to making this a better world. And the way to do it is for us to join forces, educate each other about our common experiences, our common aspirations, no matter which race we are. As my little granddaughter even actually says, we are from the same tree, but we have different branches, but we are rooted in this country. So I really, it makes me feel so good that a young person knows about this right now. I actually have mixed race grandchildren, and they are encouraged to recognize the identity that they have with pride and appreciation. They're white, Hispanic, Native American, and Chinese. So they celebrate that diversity that makes them who they are. My daughter actually teaches Chinese dancing, traditional dancing. She has been on the Asian American Parent Council on both of the kids' schools and has had Lunar New Year celebrations at both schools. Lots of times the teachers don't even know about Chinese American history. I was present at the 150th anniversary of the completion of the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad. I bought the book about the Chinese railroad workers, and I approached the administration and I asked them if I could talk about the work of the railroad workers. And that's a shared experience that Japanese Americans also have with us as well. And I think the thing that we all have to do is recognize the contributions of all races that have tried to make it in this country and the contributions that they all have made to making it a better country. Unfortunately, we have people who want to take the full credit of making this country the great country that we are. But we have to educate everyone that all of us have contributed to making it a better country. And again, we have partnered with C.A.C.A, OCA, even when we were seeking the apologies for the Chinese Exclusion Act. We actually had Jewish community, African American community, all of those great people of all races to join with us as partners to accomplish that legislation.
Let's see. Thank you so much. I'm sure that your grandkids are beautiful. That's a wonderful.
I do think they are.
Wonderful. Okay, Dianne, can you tell us what's next as you are continuing Secretary Mineta's legacy?
When we started the film project and also the accompanying curriculum, we needed an umbrella name for both things, not just the film name. So we hit upon the Mineta Legacy Project, sort of foreshadowing that we knew that Norm's body of work would live on forever. And so our website, the Mineta Legacy Project, we've now retooled it a little bit to reflect some of what's been going on today. So if you need information about any of the memorial services that are being held across the country in DC or in San Jose or in Los Angeles, we have that on our website. If you're interested in making a memorial donation, there's preferred donor sites that is on our website. And if you have pictures or memories of Norm that you want to share, and people have started to populate that already. So we're seeing these snapshots. You know how Norm would always stop and take a picture with you. So we have that and little anecdotes, which is really nice. So again, that's MinetaLegacyProject.com. But we continue to honor Norm's legacy by showing the film for free right now. It's streamable, and you can find that on the site, and also trying to encourage more teachers to use the free online curriculum. What does it mean to be an American was inspired by Norm. So it's not just about Norm's life, but it's about all the aspects of being an American. And the components include immigration or civic engagement or civil liberties and equity, leadership, US-Japan relations. And these are all lessons that that teachers can download and are particularly relevant to today.
Wonderful. So the last question that I have for all of you today is, I'd like for you to, in 2 words, give us 2 words that describe Norman Mineta. Okay, you're on the spot. Let's go backwards this time. And Dianne, why don't you start? 2 words.
Integrity and accessible.
Wonderful. Carolyn?
Loving and caring.
Floyd?
How about magnificent mentor?
And Mike?
Presence and thoughtfulness.
And Maeley?
Heroic icon.
All of them were perfect. They really, encapsulate who is this wonderful American hero of ours. Well, I'm sure that we have all learned a lot today about the iconic statesman Norman Mineta. We'll always be indebted to his leadership that profoundly transformed our AAPI community to be more aware, more active, and involved. On behalf of the Chinese American Heritage Foundation and our co-sponsors, thank you to our guest presenters, amazing panelists, and to you for tuning in tonight. As we wrap up AAPI Heritage Month 2022, be proud of our history. Be aware of our struggles and successes, of who we are and who we are yet to be. Now we will view the remaining video tributes to conclude the program. Thank you again.
Thank you to the Chinese American Heritage Foundation and Chinese American Citizens Alliance Boston for hosting today's memorial tribute to Secretary Norm Mineta. Norm passed at the start of the Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, a time when we celebrate our heritage and our history. There's a poignancy to this because Norm unequivocally left his impact on American history. He was a trailblazer, role model, and a mentor who served as the first Asian American mayor of a major American city, a 10-term congressman, and a cabinet secretary for both Democrat and Republican administrations. He served first as the Secretary of Commerce and then as the longest-serving Secretary of Transportation in our nation's history. These accomplishments would make him a political giant by any standard, but they're just a sliver of Norm's immense contributions to American history. He's also remembered for all that he did for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community. He was a co-founder and the first chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus and the founder of the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. He was also the first chair of the President's Advisory Commission on AAPIs under President Clinton. In Congress, he pushed through landmark legislation for the U.S. government to apologize and provide redress for the imprisonment of Japanese Americans in World War II, a horrific chapter in our nation's history that Norm had personally experienced. In so many ways, the foundations of the advocacy work that political and community leaders continue to do today on behalf of the AANHPI community is built on the foundation that Norm laid. Norm was such an incredible inspiration to many, including myself. We owe a debt of gratitude for all he did to uplift and empower our communities. Despite all he accomplished, he always prioritized opening doors for future AANHPI leaders. He showed us how much we could achieve and pulled us up with him. And Norm especially valued mentoring young people like students and interns who were interested in advocating for our communities. There is no doubt that we are a stronger community and a stronger nation because of Norm's leadership. When he passed, it wasn't just the passing of a well-respected leader. It was the passing of a friend and mentor for so many of us. So thank you for inviting me to join today's memorial honoring Norm Mineta, a truly remarkable leader, passionate advocate for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, and a genuine and kind man. His life and legacy of public service will never be forgotten.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Grace Meng from New York, and it's an honor to pay tribute to our hero, Norm Mineta. 10 years ago, when I first ran for Congress, Norm was one of the first to call me to offer words of encouragement and advice. I remember that call like it was yesterday. It was a tremendous honor to speak with him and to learn from a giant in our community. I'll never forget the kindness and mentorship that Norm showed by reaching out and wanting to be helpful to my candidacy. One of the first times I met Norm was in 2014 during a ceremony at the Department of Labor when the Chinese laborers who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad were inducted into the Labor Hall of Honor. Norm was a trailblazer in every sense of the word, an outstanding public servant and exemplary human being who knocked down barriers, serving as the first Asian American mayor of a major U.S. city in the lower 48 states, a congressman, and the first Asian American cabinet secretary who worked under both a Democrat and Republican president. He was an inspiration to so many in the Asian American community and paved the path for Asian Americans to run for office and enter government. From being the co-founder and first chair of C.A.C.A to helping obtain compensation and apologies for Japanese American citizens incarcerated during World War II, he never stopped fighting for our community. But his work went beyond empowering and lifting up only Asian Americans. He was a great leader for our whole country. He made immense contributions to our nation, championing so many issues that included everything from transportation to civil liberties. He served our country in the Army and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the nation's highest civilian honor. Norm Mineta represented the best America had to offer. He worked tirelessly to improve the lives of Americans and did so with great honor and dignity. I will always cherish the memories and the incredible legacy that Norm left behind. I am proud to salute the many achievements and contributions that Norm made and hope that his legacy is an inspiration for many generations to come. Thank you to the Chinese American Heritage Foundation and Chinese American Citizens Alliance Boston for putting together this virtual memorial, and thanks to all the co-sponsors as well. Thank you.
Secretary Norman Y. Mineta meant so much to so many of us in the Japanese American community, the broader Asian Pacific American community, and to all of us as Americans. In a city where people are remembered for their singular contribution to our country, Secretary Mineta had many of those iconic moments, beginning with the signing of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which achieved redress for formerly incarcerated Japanese Americans, just like Secretary Mineta had been as a 10-year-old boy. That was when he first came to understand the importance of his American citizenship and the rights that we all have with that title. But some of his strongest stands were not for the Japanese American or Asian American community, but in his leadership in passing legislation such as the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Japanese American Citizens League would not be the organization we are today without Norm's leadership in pushing us to affirm the rights of all people to marry, when JCL became the first non-LGBTQ focused national organization to publicly support gay marriage. Taking stands like that may have cost us members, and in Norm's case donors and voters, but he always emphasized that what was important was that you did what was right. He continued to lead our community on issues such as anti-Muslim hate, and was in the White House as Secretary of Transportation, providing the much-needed perspective of how unbridled hate in times of war can have dire consequences for Americans who might look like the enemy. More recently, he spoke out against immigrant family and child detention and in favor of long overdue reparations for the Black community. He understood the need and the power in standing together in solidarity. And yet, despite all of his success at the national stage, he was always Norm to anyone who met him. He remembered names and faces in a way that I can only dream of. He was often the last to leave the JCL Sayonara banquet because he took the time to welcome and take a picture with everyone who went to greet him. And while it was often the adults who were excited to meet him, he always took the time to meet the children because he understood the importance of family, beginning with his own, but extending to everyone he met and worked with. We recognize the loss as especially great for his beloved wife, Denny, his sons, David and Stuart, stepsons, Robert and Mark, and his 11 grandchildren. To you, we all continue to send our love and share your pain. At this time in our country, what seems that it is so hard to achieve the successes that Norm did, we must hold hope that his legacy of seeking to do what was right and working with others to achieve it is not lost, whether it might be to achieve better policies in gun safety or extending the successes of Japanese American redress to our Black brothers and sisters. The Mineta Simpson Institute at Heart Mountain, Wyoming will break ground this summer as a living tribute to the bipartisan friendship that Secretary Mineta and Senator Alan Simpson kept from childhood all the way through Norm's passing. The recently passed Asian Pacific American Museum Study Commission and increasing funding to the Japanese American Confinement Sites Program with special funding for education will ensure that stories like Norm's will continue to be reinterpreted for future generations to learn of both what we might think inconceivable for a country to do under the motivations of racism and hatred, but also what can we do in response, that we do have a capacity to forgive, but not forget. Norm always loved his country and acted to always do what he thought was best. It's our turn now to carry on that legacy, to do what is best for our country, for our American family. Thank you, Norm. May you rest in power.
My name is David S. Kim, and I'm a member of the Council of Korean Americans. Norm Mineta was an incredible person, truly one of a kind. And I really think he set the standard for leadership in the entire AANHPI community and beyond, because he was a servant leader who led with authenticity, sincerity, and humility. One thing I will always remember is that he would frequently mention in his speeches the importance of mentorship. He said all of us have a responsibility and duty to take the time to help those who are coming up behind us, just as many of us benefited from the guidance and advice of those who held leadership positions before us. He was such a strong believer in passing on lessons learned to the next generation of leaders, our successes as well as failures. I always took his words to heart and would oftentimes mention Norm's call to action in my own speeches. And like so many people in our community, I have been on the receiving end of his generosity, friendship, and mentorship over the years. And I will never forget the time when he attended an event held for me after I was appointed to serve as Secretary of Transportation in California. He spoke at that event, and his words were so incredibly heartfelt and kind. He was truly ecstatic about my being appointed to the position, and he shared in the joy and excitement just like a family member, which I consider him to be. Norm lived a life of purpose. He had a great sense of humor, a warm smile, a twinkle in his eye, and he had a genuine love for people, and it is abundantly clear everyone loved him back. And of course, he was a passionate, lifelong advocate for our community who always cared so deeply about the well-being of the entire AANHPI community. We could not have had a better champion. I personally see him as an inspiration, role model, mentor, and friend, and I truly believe he was the heart and soul of our community. Norm will never be forgotten and will always live in our hearts. My deepest condolences to Denny, Stuart, David, and the entire extended family, as well as to all of you whose lives were touched by Norm. Thank you.
Secretary Norman Mineta was a beacon for our community. As a longtime friend of OCA, he gave his unwavering support by always showing up for the OCA community, like at the JCL OCA Leadership Summits or OCA National Conventions. His strength and passion has inspired and empowered generations of advocates in pursuing ANHPI representation in public service, equity, and justice. He offered both optimism and firm criticism and a warm, personable attitude where he treated young advocates with as much respect as he himself was due. I remember meeting him once when I had just started my career in Washington, D.C. I was one of many young staffers with whom he exchanged greetings with at a screening of his documentary. Years later, I called on him for a project OCA was doing, and as I was attempting to describe how we had met and remind him who I was, he exclaimed, "Of course, I know you and OCA." He was always incredibly passionate, kind, and generous with his time. He always made it a point to attend intern networking receptions and never cut a conversation short with the many young professionals who flocked to meet him. Just even about 7 months ago, he joined our Zoom event on 9/11 because he felt it important to make sure our community remembered and learned our history by sharing his experience and wisdom. Secretary Mineta moved mountains. His legacy is one that history will never and must never forget. His bipartisanship and community building was imitable and the epitome of what we should all strive to accomplish. As we continue to celebrate our ANHPI heritage beyond the month of May, we remember Norman Mineta and follow in his blazing footsteps.